Chapter 641. Passion Jewelry's owner was indeed a despicable being. He found a lawyer and sued Soul Jewelry for defamation, making the feud between them public. The netizens enjoyed the fight between the two companies very much as they wondered who would win in the end. Some of them said that Soul Jewelry had gone over their head after all the attention they were getting, but the others also said that the owner of Passion Jewelry deserved it. Sitting in her office, Maisie was looking at the data on a tablet. One of the staff members knocked on the door and walked in. Ms. Vanderbilt, Passion Jewelry said that they're going to sue us for defamation. Maisie replied without lifting her head, let them be. At the same time, Sadie entered with a man in her hand. She kicked him onto the floor, stunning the staff member. Who is this guy? The guy who injured Uncle Kennedy. Maisie put down her tablet and looked at the young man who was pinned on the floor by Sadie. The owner of Passion Jewelry wants to sue me for defamation, but I haven't said anything about them spreading fake news about my death and getting someone to acquire my company. Seems like it's about time for me to pay a visit to Passion Jewelry. At Passion Jewelry. Maisie emerged from the car wearing a pair of sunglasses. Sadie was following behind her with the man in her hand. All of the employees in Passion Jewelry were stunned when they saw Maisie and Sadie. Maisie had not made any reservation. She went straight to the administrative office of Passion Jewelry while Sadie kicked the door open and pushed the young man into it. The young man fell into the office, and the middle-aged man in the office jerked up from his seat. His face was dark as he hissed. Who are you? How dare you come and cause trouble in Passion Jewelry? Maisie ignored him and walked inside. Seems like Mr. Ludwig has forgotten a lot of things. Well, I can see why since you're so busy. Anyway, what makes you think that I can't come and look for you after what you did to the executive of Soul Jewelry? Mr. Ludwig was stunned. However, since both of them were women, he did not take them seriously. He sat down and replied. Then what makes you think that you can stand up for Soul Jewelry, huh? You're just two women. Maisie walked up to the couch and sat with her legs crossed. A smile tugged at the corner of her lips as she said, even if we're women, we can take on you or your group without any problem. If you don't believe me, you can try and see it for yourself. A group of 8 bodyguards appeared in the office and surrounded Maisie and Sadie. Sitting in his chair, Mr. Ludwig lit up a cigar and chuckled. It appears to me that Soul Jewelry doesn't have any men anymore. So they sent 2 women to their death instead. Know your own place, women. I have a backer, so if I get mad, I won't care if you're a man or a woman. Maisie chuckled. Really? Do you think your bodyguards can stop Sadie? After that, she looked at Sadie and said, Sadie, don't need to hold yourself back. I'll leave it to your own decision whether you want them to be crippled or hospitalized. Sadie took off her jacket and threw it on the floor. She put on the brass knuckles and looked at them fiercely. Sadie was one from the metropolis and had gone through many things. She had pulled the trigger before, her hands were drenched in blood, and she had carved herself a path out of a pile of dead bodies. She was not an ordinary bodyguard but a cold-blooded killing machine. Those bodyguards did not take Sadie seriously. They approached her and one of them got kicked to the corner while she grabbed the neck of another one. The rest of the people were startled, and they took a step back. Mr. Ludwig seemed to have forgotten about his cigar as he stared fixedly and dumbfoundedly at the woman who could lift a strong man with one arm. Sadie threw the man toward Mr. Ludwig, and he was so scared that he hid under the desk. The bodyguard landed on the desk and swept the computer and all documents on the floor. Chapter 642. Mr. Ludwig scrambled up from the floor and looked at them with his face pale. Stop. Stop whatever you're doing, Do you want to call the cops, Mr. Ludwig? Maisie interrupted him flatly, well, you can do that. But the only problem is that are you able to? What do you mean? Maisie rose to her feet and walked toward the frightened young man. She grabbed his collars back and pulled him to the desk. She threw him in front of Mr. Ludwig, startling him. She then grabbed the young man's head and forced him to look at Mr. Ludwig. "Do you know this guy?" Mr. Ludwig did not reply. Maisie looked at the young man and said, "Say it. How much did he pay you for Kennedy's arm?" The young man replied fretfully, $15,000. I'll give you $150,000. "Break one of his legs for me," Maisie said with a devilish smile, tugging at the corner of her lips. Mr. Ludwig's face turned pale. Are you crazy? Since you can hire someone to harm the people from Seoul and even want to break his arm, why can't I do the same to you?" Maisie rose to her feet and glanced across the bodyguards that did not dare to act rashly. "Whoever breaks his leg, I'll give him the money." The bodyguards were stumped. They looked at each other in shock and wavered. After all, they just needed to break his leg, and they could get $150,000. Who would say no to easy money? Mr. Ludwig became even more fretful when he saw that the bodyguards were wavering. Who are you? And what do you want?" Maisie removed her sunglasses and approached him. "Seems to me that you can't recognize me, Mr. Ludwig." "Oh well, it doesn't really matter, though. I can tell you who I am. I'm Zora, the person who you go around and tell others that I'm dead. I'm also Alice. And my real name is Maisie Vanderbilt." Mr. Ludwig might not know who Alice was, but he knew who Maisie was. Zora was Maisie, and that meant she was the deceased wife of Nolan Goldman. When the scale finally fell from his eyes, he was so stunned that he did not know how to react. How is this possible? Aren't you already? Who told you I'm dead? Besides the news about my divorce with Mr. Goldman 3 years ago, did they report my death? Mr. Ludwig was stumped. It was true that the news had not reported her death. Most of the information on the internet was nothing but hearsay. Besides, it had been 3 years, so no one could verify the truth. "Now that you already know my identity, I'll give you 2 options. 1, let me break one of your legs, and 2nd, leave Passion Jewelry and let other people take your seat," Maisie said. She crossed her arms in front of her chest, and it was only now Mr. Ludwig found out what the phrase, covering a dagger with a smile, truly meant. However, he suddenly thought of something and laughed boisterously. "You and Mr. Goldman are no longer husband and wife. No matter how strong your people are, there's nothing you can do to me. If you dare to break my leg, you won't be able to walk out of there easily." Maisie nodded. "All right then. I suppose you've made your choice." She pulled a card out of her purse and put it on the desk. After that, she turned around to face the bodyguards and said, "My offer still stands. There is $150,000 in this card. It doesn't have a password. And whoever breaks his leg gets it." The bodyguards rushed forward as soon as Maisie stopped speaking. Some of them even began to fight each other, and it was a gruesome scene. Maisie and Sadai walked to the door. They saw 3 or 2 bodyguards rushing over and kicking Mr. Ludwig. One of them even raised a chair and hit him hard on the leg. Mr. Ludwig hissed in pain, and his scream could be heard from the office to the empty corridor. Maisie turned around and said to Sadai, "Call the police. Tell them that there is a fight in Passion Jewelry." The police arrived at Passion Jewelry 20 minutes later. The people involved in the fight were taken away, and Mr. Ludwig was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. The pedestrians who saw this scene took out their phones and began taking photos. Chapter 643. Maisie looked at everything that happened outside through the window of the car. She said to Sadai, "Let's go to the police station and deliver these materials to the police." This was the reason she had not handed over the evidence. Even without those half-baked bodyguards, she would still ask Sadai to do the same, and now, she finally had helped Kennedy get his revenge. Even if Mr. Ludwig wanted to push all the blame to her, he wouldn't be able to do it with these materials in her hands. Nolan's car was stopped outside of the police station. When he saw Maisie and Sadie coming out of the police station, he rolled down the window and asked, "Have things gone out of hand?" Maisie pressed forward and leaned on the window. Blinking her eyes, she said, "Yeah, things have gone a little bit out of hand. I even asked someone to beat him up." Nolan scratched the tip of her nose and replied, "Well, he deserves it. What if he finds someone to get revenge on me?" Maisie asked, pretending to be scared. Nolan narrowed his eyes and chuckled. He wouldn't have the chance. At the hospital, Mr. Ludwig's leg was strapped in a cast. He had made several phone calls for help, but for some reason, when he said it was about Nolan's ex-wife, those people either hung up the phone or said they couldn't help. He called a friend in Esperia who had some relations with the authorities. It took him long enough to convince him to help him, but his friend called him back after a few moments and said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Ludwig. I can't help you. There's nothing I can do either." Mr. Ludwig jerked up from his bed and winced in pain. "Why? She's just a bitch. Why is there nothing you can do?" "It isn't that I don't want to help you. It's my higher-ups. They told me to stay out of this. You're in a deep shit right now. And they don't want to get dragged down by you." Mr. Ludwig's expression changed, and he became agitated. "What do you mean by I'm in a deep shit myself? Someone has handed the evidence of your dealings to the police. The people above are asking for an investigation. And the Chases handle it. The Chases don't allow anyone to offer you any help, and I guess you'll be summoned to the court soon. I wish you good luck, brother." That person hung up the call very soon. Before Mr. Ludwig could come around to his senses, a group of police appeared outside of his ward. Several days later, Passion Jewelry was found for cooking the books, and they were found to have adulterated some of the raw materials used in jewelry making. After Mr. Ludwig was brought into the investigation, several shareholders withdrew their capital overnight in fear of getting involved. The employees of Passion Jewelry went on a strike to demand their wages, eventually forcing both the store and the company to close to prevent the situation from worsening. Maisie and Sadie visited Kennedy in the hospital with a bouquet in their hands. Kennedy was reading a newspaper on the bed, and he looked rather healthy. He put the newspaper down and smiled at Maisie. "Z, how is everything going in the office? Is everyone doing fine?" Maisie put the flowers in a vase and replied, "Everyone is doing fine. You don't have to worry about anything. All you need to do is rest and get well soon." She walked to the bed and sat down. "How are your arms?" Kennedy looked at his right arm, which was still in a cast. "I can't pick anything heavy with my right arm yet. It took a long time to recover from an injury, not to mention that his arms were severely fractured. The injuries in his right arm were more severe than his left arm. And he might have some problems in his daily life in the future." Maisie recounted what had happened to Mr. Ludwig. Kennedy had heard the news as well, but he was suspicious of the entire fighting incident. After all, he had heard that someone broke Mr. Ludwig's leg. And it seemed more like someone was getting revenge on him. Maisie smiled. She was not going to hide it from Kennedy, so she said, "He hired someone to break your arms, so I just gave him a taste of his own medicine and taught him a lesson." Chapter 644. Kennedy lowered his head and said, "Then this is quite a hard lesson for him. Not only did he break his leg and get hospitalized, but he also needed to face a lawsuit, and his assets would be frozen." Maisie suddenly thought of something and asked, "By the way, did the woman who saved you that night leave her address and name?" "She saved your life, so I have to thank her for you in person." Kennedy was stunned for a moment. Then, he smiled and said, "Nope. But I'll need to thank her too if I have the chance to see her again." Maisie came out of the ward after spending some time with Kennedy. When she and Sadie were waiting for the elevator in the corridor, the door opened, and the person who came out of it was none other than Maisie. Maisie did not know Maisie, but she felt the woman standing beside Maisie was familiar. She took another 2 glances at her and suddenly remembered something. She grabbed Sadie's arm and asked, "It's you? Aren't you Mr. Goldman's subordinate? What are you doing here in the hospital?" Sadie looked at her but did not say anything. Maisie peeled Maisie's hand away and asked, "Do you have a problem with my secretary, Ms. Hannigan?" It was only then Maisie looked toward Maisie, her eyes filled with shock. Women would feel threatened when they saw another woman who was more beautiful than themselves. She frowned slightly and asked, "This woman is your secretary?" "Yeah. Do you have a problem with that?" Maisie said, grinning. Maisie studied her from her head to her toe. She found that she looked very similar to the woman in the office that day. If Sadie was her secretary, then... "So you're Mr. Goldman's new lover?" Maisie asked, her voice thick with derision. She was very upset at the thought of letting Maisie get the jump on her. "Seems like you're rather good at playing your cards." Maisie squinted her eyes. "Really? I'll take it as a compliment then, Ms. Hannigan." She looked at her watch and said, "I have other things to attend to, so I'm going to take my leave first. See you around, Ms. Hannigan." After that, Maisie turned around. Just when she was about to step into the elevator, Maisie's voice wafted from behind. "I heard that Mr. Goldman had a wife before. Are you not worried that he won't be able to forget about his ex-wife after he regains his memory?" Standing in the elevator, Maisie put on her sunglasses and replied with a smile, "Nope. I don't worry about that at all." The door was slowly closing, and Maisie stamped her feet in anger as she looked at the confident smile on the face of the woman in the elevator. Maisie walked toward Nathaniel's ward. Tanner was inside the ward, and both of them were having a fight, like what they used to do whenever they saw each other. Maisie pressed her ear close to the door and listened. Suddenly, the door was opened from inside, and she nearly fell to the floor. She raised her head and saw Tanner. His face dark. "Brother," Tanner ignored her and walked away. She walked into the ward and asked, "Dad, are you having a fight with Tanner again?" "Humph. Humph. That brat won't be satisfied until I die from anger." Nathaniel took the oxygen mask and inhaled deeply. He was going to get a heart attack if he stayed for one more second with Tanner. Maisie pressed her lips thin and did not make any comment. She knew that Tanner had not accepted her and her mother until now. However, she was not bothered by it. After all, it wouldn't affect him much if she married into the Bouchers. Suddenly, Nathaniel opened his mouth and said, "Maisie, about your marriage with the Bouchers." I think Maisie was stunned. She seemed to have realized something when she saw the serious expression on her father's face. She bit her lips and said, "Did the Bouchers reject?" "I heard that it's Helios who asked Mr. Goldman to set a trap for us. Obviously, he's against the marriage between our families." Maisie froze and clenched her fist tightly. She knew that Helios was not against the marriage between their families, he just did not want to marry her. Chapter 6:45. Maisie was certain that those socialites would laugh at her again. In fact, she was not concerned about whether or not Helios would marry her. All she cared about was how others would look at her. Besides, she wanted to find a man like Nolan who would dote on his wife. Helios was outstanding and multi-talented and had a good-looking face. However, he was an actor and needed to shoot scenes with other actresses. Nolan, on the other hand, was different. According to her investigation, Nolan rarely had any interaction with other women. And his ex-wife was the only woman he had till this day. A man who was loyal to his loved one was the most attractive. At Soul Jewelry, Maisie received a call from Quincy. He told her that it was Barbara's father who handled the investigation of Mr. Ludwig, and she was surprised. She tried to ask Riley about it through WhatsApp, but unfortunately, Riley did not know about it at all. Therefore, she knew that it was not Riley who had asked Barbara to help her. She did not know if Barbara was trying to help her or if she did not like Mr. Ludwig as well. Thanks to her help from the side, Mr. Ludwig was completely cut off from his connections. Riley, Z, Barbara invited me to a gem hunting event this weekend, and she asked me to bring you along. She said that you must be very familiar with gem hunting. So do you want to come with us? Maisie thought for a long while before replying, okay. No matter what Barbara was up to, she indeed had helped Maisie in taking Mr. Ludwig down. As such, she figured that she needed to return the favor. At night, Maisie was doing her skincare routine in front of the dresser after taking her bath. Nolan came in from outside, bent down, wrapped his arms around her shoulders, and buried his nose into the back of her neck. As he inhaled deeply, he said, Z. You smell so good. Maisie felt itchy and shrunk her neck. Giggling, she said, I just got out of the shower. Of course, I smell good. You smell good in normal times too. Nolan breathed into her ear, his voice deep. She put the lotion on the table and turned her head to look at him. I'm going out with my friends this weekend. If I haven't come back before evening, you don't have to wait for me for dinner. Nolan collected her cascading hair in his hand and looked at her intently. Are they men or women? Women, Maisie replied as she lifted her eyebrows. Are you worried about me? While Nolan was kissing her forehead, he replied, You're too pretty, Z. Of course, I will worry about you. Maisie was tickled pink by Nolan's reply. She wrapped her arms around his neck and allowed him to carry her to the bed. When she lay down, her hair spread out on the bed. She looked even more alluring. Nolan ran his finger over Maisie's eyebrows and said, Now I can believe what you've said. Huh? She blinked, his warm lips slid down lightly along the corners of her eyes, and it made her want even more. He said, You told me that I wooed you because I was captivated by your beauty. Maisie was stunned. She had just been messing with him that time. She did not expect him to believe in her at all. That's so adorable. Maisie lifted her hand to cover his eyes and said, Will you still be attracted to me if I become old and ugly? Nolan paused for a moment and looked at her deeply. I've been in love with you so much that I cannot stop myself from loving you anymore. Maisie chuckled, You're such a glib talker. Nolan caressed her palm and replied, So do you like it? Maisie said something into his ear, and Nolan was stunned. He looked at her gently and leaned onto her. Chapter 646. During the weekend, Riley and Maisie were the first to arrive at Antique Street, the largest antique trading market in Bassburg. In addition to ceramics and gems, there were also painting collections, not to mention the ancient jewelry. This area was an ancient street composed of 2 blocks of retro and elegant buildings. There were all kinds of exquisite antique and local specialty delicacies sold by stalls and shop lots located all over this street. Riley and Maisie had already waited outside the auction building where the gem hunting event would take place for quite some time when they saw Barbara walking towards them with 2 bodyguards. I'm sorry, it must have been a long wait. Barbara walked up to them and smiled apologetically. Didn't expect that there would be so many people here on the weekend that my car couldn't get in. It took such a long time to find a parking space. Maisie smiled. It's okay, Riley, and I just arrived. Barbara nodded. What a relief. I've already reserved 3 seats for us, and they're all located in the front row. Let's go, time to go in and get ourselves some raw gemstones. All of them walked into the auction building that housed the gem hunting event, and the first thing that caught their eyes was the magnificent and grand lobby. There were many people in it. And most of them were wearing masquerade masks and dressed in extraordinary clothes. Those who would attend the gem hunting event were either businessmen who had a thing for antiques or people who were filthy rich, and they were here to try their luck. The ushers came toward them in masquerade masks and handed each of them a mask. Maisie put on the masquerade mask while Riley asked her suspiciously, Why is everyone wearing masks? Maisie leaned into her ear and explained, On such an occasion, what's on the line makes it enigmatic, so the more mysterious the event is, the better. Hence, wearing a mask makes things run smoother and more conveniently. Riley was still confused when Maisie was already halfway through her explanation. That was when Barbara turned around to look at her and added with a smile, "What Ms. Vanderbilt is trying to say is that wearing a mask can save all the attendees some unnecessary trouble. You'll win the auction or bet without knowing the identities of both parties, so it depends solely on the financial resources that both parties possess and how confident one is. In short, no matter if you're here to make a profit or give your money away for nothing, as long as others can't see your face, no one will catch up to you later on to pick a fight with you. Making a fuss in the auction building is a forbidden action. Law and order here are extremely strict. So, if someone were to be caught creating a stir here and got their identity exposed, it'd only be exceptionally embarrassing for them. Some wealthy businessmen in the past were worried that they would be retaliated against by those who had lost money and were jealous of their score. Thus, they came up with a way to prevent needless incidents, and that's by wearing masks. Maisie looked at her. "You're no stranger to such occasions, huh?" Barbara did not conceal her true colors. "To be honest, I'm only interested in antiques, especially gems, compared to the other ladies who love their diamonds." The receptionist standing on both sides of the entrance bowed respectfully to welcome them into the exhibition hall. The glass cabinets on display around the hall were filled with raw gemstones that had been evaluated and had their prices marked. All the raw gemstones were of different shapes and sizes, all arranged in order according to their pricing. Strong spotlights were beaming on them from all corners of the cabinet, which allowed the guests to distinguish the texture and pattern of the raw gemstones so that they could judge whether they contained precious gems. Riley leaned over again. "Don't these look just like ordinary stones? Where are the gems?" Maisie chuckled. "Rough diamonds all look like stones too." Riley pouted. "Well, what Z said makes sense. I just asked a dumb question." Barbara went to the other side to take a look at the other stones while Riley followed Maisie around. Maisie stared at the raw gemstones in the glass cabinet and asked her casually, "Why would Barbara think of inviting us here to look at raw gemstones?" She said she's bored, and she's always wanted to come here to take a look at the raw gemstones that this place has to offer. However, Jenny has never been interested in these, and she didn't want to come alone. So she invited us. Maisie turned her head to look at her and tapped her fingertips lightly on the glass casing. "Barbara has only met me once, and she's already helped me with Mr. Ludwig's affairs. I can't see through her intentions." Chapter 647. Barbara doesn't know me well. We only got in touch when Riley introduced me to the group the other day. If she were someone I've kept in touch with all this while, to the point that I'm very close and familiar with her. I'd appreciate what she's done to help me, but Riley didn't ask Barbara to help me out in that incident, so I can't say that I'm not somewhat suspicious. Riley paused for a moment. "Are you referring to the owner of Passion Jewelry?" She then looked around and raised her hand to lower her voice. "Barbara helped you with that?" Maisie nodded. Riley gave her a thumbs up with a smile. "She's quite a loyal one then. She's willing to help you even though you haven't known each other for a long time." Maisie smiled helplessly. "She helped me for no reason? What do you think?" "Ms. Vanderbilt," Barbara called her from not far away. Maisie turned her head and saw that Barbara was waving at them. The two of them walked toward her. Barbara was troubled by the two raw gemstones listed as raw gemstone number 2 and number 6, respectively. "I have a hunch that both might contain gems, but I can't be sure." Maisie got Barbara's intention. Barbara was asking Maisie to help her pick one. Barbara has come to such occasions before this, which means that she's not a newbie and has her own understanding when it comes to judging raw gemstones. Yet, she's asking me to choose on her behalf. Maisie's gaze was fixed on the two raw gemstones. And she picked up a flashlight with a strong light and pointed it at the stones. Gem hunting called for someone's ability to determine the probability of a raw gemstone containing a precious gem just by looking at the surface of the raw gemstone. And the surface of rough gemstones could generally be categorized into 3 types: gritty, coarse, and fine surface. The finer the surface, the better. The finer surface meant that water had gotten into the ore before this, and in that case, the possibility of obtaining a gem would be very high. Maisie leaned over to inspect the surface of raw gemstone #2 and number 6. The surface of raw gemstone number 2 looked finer than that of number 6, but she could not see the fluidity in the pattern of the stone. Nor did she see any tiny emerald particles on the surface. Barbara looked at her. Doesn't raw gemstone number 2 look more like it? Maisie nodded. Indeed, but I can't see emerald particles. And I can't guarantee that it'll contain a gem. The appearances of a raw gemstone easily deceived some people, and gem hunting was all about the gambling factor. Many hesitant people made mistakes because they were not sure. Of course, when faced with such a situation, all there was to do was cross one's finger and wish for the best. Maisie got back up and straightened her posture. Are you planning to go for it? Barbara paused for a split second, lowered her gaze, and pondered for a moment. She then looked back up at her. I believe in you. Maisie did not expect her to say this and was about to say something when a voice that came from not far away attracted their attention. A middle-aged man in a mask and a suit yelled at the staff. Seemingly because the staff would not allow the young woman in his arms to bring her pet into the venue. At first glance, the woman was estimated to be around 30 years old, and she was dressed quite glamorously. She was holding a white poodle in her arms. And she looked aggrieved and was cringing in the man's arms. The man protected her tightly in his arms, and his reprimand kept attracting the attention of the people around him. However, the staff member could only apologize. Barbara was not surprised by such an event and discovered something. It seems that rich men these days love to bring their mistresses to places like this. Maisie looked at her. How can you be so sure that she's his mistress? Barbara smiled. That woman doesn't have a ring on her finger. And isn't the man still wearing his wedding ring? Maisie was surprised that Barbara was actually observing instead of just looking, and she only noticed that the woman did not have a wedding ring on when she looked over again. If they were a loving couple, the woman wouldn't have taken off her wedding ring. This makes the man someone else's husband and the woman his mistress. He has the balls to bring his mistress to such a place in such an ostentatious manner only because he's wearing a mask. The people that don't know him will naturally think that she's his wife. She then looked back at Barbara again and noticed that Barbara's gaze was fixed on them, and a creepy tinge of amusement could be seen through the corners of her lips. Maisie squinted her eyes and could not help but start to guess. She suddenly remembered that Riley was able to hold herself back from commenting anything about the man or the woman and said, Riley, don't you like to be a part of such fun? Why don't you? Chapter 648. Maisie turned her head around. Where is Riley? Riley rinsed her face with water in the restroom and looked astonished. Although he was wearing a mask, that middle-aged man is Helios' uncle, if I'm not mistaken. And the woman standing next to Helios' uncle is definitely not his aunt. Is Helios' uncle cheating on his wife? No, I have to go back and have another look. Riley picked up her mask immediately and walked out of the bathroom. She had just put on her mask when she bumped into someone at the corridor's corner. She staggered backward, and the man supported her in time. She then heard a familiar voice coming from above her head before seeing the person. Riley Hill? Riley held on to her mask and raised her head instantly. Although the tall man in front of her was wearing a mask, his jawline looked extremely familiar. Especially when it came to his voice. How can you still recognize me? She adjusted her dress. Louis' deep scoff came from the top of her head. I can recognize you at a glance and from miles away just by looking at your body figure. Riley froze in place for a split second and took a deep breath. Louis Lucas. Will you die as long as you don't get to mock me with my figure? Louis inserted his hands into the pockets of his trench coat. Why are you here? Who did you come here with? That's none of your business. Riley was so angry that she was about to leave. Louis grabbed her arm, dragged her back, and stepped forward to block her way. Does Uncle Hill have the money to allow you to come to such a place and go on a spending spree irresponsibly? Riley grabbed him by the hem of his collar, stood on tiptoe, glared at him, and gnashed her teeth. I'm not here to spend money. I'm only here as a companion, will this do? The top of Riley's head was barely on the same level as Lewis's shoulders while she was standing on tiptoe. His height eventually overshadowed all the domineering aura that she exuded. Lewis looked down at the little dwarf, who could not even look straight at him on the same level even when she was on tiptoe. The petite woman looked so tiny, as if she was a kitten that was about to jump up and scratch his face. Thus, he lowered his body abruptly. Riley, who was already on tiptoe, stepped back on the floor subconsciously as soon as he leaned forward, and she hit the wall with her lower back. Looking at the panic on her face, Lewis suddenly felt like teasing her. It's a pity that standing on tiptoe won't do you much. It seems that I can only sacrifice my stance. He propped his arm against the wall beside her, and his face was enlarged as he came closer and closer. It was so close that he was practically inches away from kissing her on the lips. Riley's hand that was gripping his collar tightened instantly. Thinking that he was about to kiss her, she closed her eyes tightly. After a long while a scoff passed by her ears. Are you expecting me to kiss you? Riley pushed him away abruptly. He was pushed backward. But he regained his balance in an instant. You crazy piece of shit, she shouted and ran away without looking back. Lewis watched her silhouette disappear into the corner, rubbed his chin, and fell into contemplation. Riley returned to the raw gemstone exhibition area angrily. Maisie and Barbara had already completed their tour around the hall, looking at the raw gemstones displayed in the entire area. Seeing that Riley seemed to have been annoyed, Maisie laughed and teased her. Given your stance, did you leave us to go fight someone? I didn't fight anyone. It's just that I ran into someone that I despise. Riley was about to explode with wrath. Maisie quickly understood who Riley was referring to when she said she saw someone she despised, because the figure in the crowd was still very eye-catching. You girls would actually come to take a look at a gem hunting event. Lewis walked toward them as he recognized them. Maisie gave Riley a meaningful sideways glance and smiled. It turns out to be you, Lewis. Are you interested in gem hunting too? Lewis shrugged. I came here with my mother. She asked Aunt Boucher to come here and get first-hand experience on gem hunting today. But Helios wasn't free today, so I could only accompany them here. Chapter 649. Riley froze instantly upon hearing that Aunt Boucher was here. She thought of something at that moment and suddenly became extraordinarily silent. Barbara wrapped her arms around Maisie's. Wow, we found ourselves a couple here. We look so pitiful all of a sudden. Of course, Barbara knew about Riley and Lewis's marriage. Only one sentence was enough to pique Riley as she dragged Maisie over to her side. Who told you that we're a couple? And how can you slander me deliberately? Barbara then dragged Maisie back to her side again. Even if you're not a couple now, you'll still be husband and wife in the future. Maisie felt a little dead inside as the duo dragged her to and from. Fortunately, the auction was about to start. And they stopped acting like two young girls fighting over a doll. They then entered the venue, where there were at least enough seats for more than 1,000 people. Barbara's reserved seats were located in the first row, near the auction platform. Maisie looked over and noticed that Mrs. Boucher, her aunt, and Lewis were also sitting in the first row. When everyone was seated, the raw gemstones that the other attendees wanted to auction appeared on the screen, and the people present began to name their price and bid. The buyer would profit from the purchase of the raw gemstone if it were to contain genuine gems. Of course, if someone else were to double their offer, the raw gemstone would go to the highest bidder. However, if the raw gemstone one bought did not contain any real gem, it would be a pure waste of money. That was why everyone in the audience acted very cautiously. The competition was indeed rather fierce. Some experts would judge the raw gemstones through the screen and finally decide whether to go for them. In the end, Raw gemstone number 2 and number 6 were displayed on the screen. These two gemstones were those that Barbara had her eyes on. The first stone that went onto the auction platform was raw gemstone number 6. Riley leaned into Barbara's ear. Will any of these two be it? Barbara stared at the screen. I'll at least be correct once? At least, that's what I hope. Someone held up a placard. 4.5 million. 5.5 million. More people were raising their placards to place their bids right now. Raw gemstone number 2's surface might look a lot smoother. But there was no fluidity in the pattern of the stone. As for raw gemstone number 6, tiny gem particles could be seen on the stone's surface, so the experts present would believe that number 6 had a higher possibility of containing a genuine gem. 12 million. The man in the middle of the hall held up his placard, and he was currently the highest bidder. Maisie looked back. The middle-aged man was the one who had brought his mistress to the auction. The woman beside him was patting the poodle in her arms and snuggled on his shoulders. Riley broke the silence abruptly. What a shit sack. Maisie turned to look at her. Do you know him? Riley did not say anything, but Barbara gave off a playful smirk. Things will get really interesting today. Before Maisie could clear her thoughts, Mrs. Boucher had raised the placard in her hand, 12.5 million. As if he did not expect a higher bid, the middle-aged man raised his placard again. 13.5 million. 14 million. Mrs. Boucher did not even blink. And now the other attendees had stopped competing and started to witness the competition between the two. The price of the gemstone skyrocketed to 14 million in under a minute. If this raw gemstone did not contain any gem, it would be equivalent to a loss of $14 million. The middle-aged man then increased his bid to 15 million, and Mrs. Boucher stopped lifting her placard. Maisie looked back and saw someone come to the side of the middle-aged man and say something to him. It could then be seen that the man immediately glanced in Mrs. Boucher's direction in the front row, looking a little awkward. He even pushed the woman in his arms away from his body. The woman reacted by acting coquettishly, so he explained something to her to get her to give up eventually. And Maisie vaguely felt a faint sensation of deceit, just like what Barbara had said just now. Raw gemstone number 6 was being cut at the moment in a live broadcast. The cutting was done backstage, and everyone present could see it with their own eyes to prevent fraud. No gem was seen when it was already halfway through, and only a tiny piece of gem appeared when it was at the end. That tiny piece of gem was definitely not as worthy as one whole piece of it. Chapter 650. The middle-aged man's expression was one of utter embarrassment. The bidding for raw gemstone number 2 began shortly after, and Barbara raised her placard as its auctioneer. 7.5 million. The price of $7.5 million in the first go shocked everyone present. After all, raw gemstone number 6 did not contain a big gem, so everyone wondered whether raw gemstone number 2 would contain anything. However, this was the only raw gemstone left for them to bid on. The middle-aged man did not dare to raise his placard anymore. He had spent $15 million for a piece of rock. But it only contained such a tiny piece of gem. Thus, Mrs. Boucher won raw gemstone number 2 with a total bidding of $12.5 million. Maisie found that Barbara seemed to have given the raw gemstone to Mrs. Boucher on purpose. Barbara could offer a starting bid of $7.5 million. Which indicates that she does possess the money, but she didn't go against Mrs. Boucher till the very end. But I can't tell whether she has other motives or she didn't dare to bet on that raw gemstone. Raw gemstone number 2 was cut straight from the middle backstage. No gem could be seen at first. But a huge piece of gem appeared when they went for a second cut, not to mention the deep emerald gem that appeared during the third cut. It contains a genuine gem. Everyone in the audience was shocked. Someone even doubled Mrs. Boucher's bid, wanting to buy the gemstone from her. Mrs. Boucher increased her bid and managed to purchase the raw gemstone for $42.5 million, and Barbara, who had chosen to auction the raw gemstone, became one of the profiteers. Barbara looked at Maisie. "You're the one who picked this raw gemstone for me. It seems that I was not wrong to choose to believe in you." Maisie smiled. "You wouldn't believe in me if you were not sure about the gemstone." Maisie witnessed a gem hunting event in person today. Although she did not participate in the auction, she got to witness a family feud live. The middle-aged man had tried to leave the scene with the woman halfway through the auction but was stopped by Mrs. Boucher's bodyguard. The bodyguard said something to him, and he followed the bodyguard to one of the lounges. When Maisie looked in the direction of Mrs. Boucher again, she found that Mrs. Boucher was no longer sitting in her seat, leaving only Louis and his aunt there. Barbara suddenly suggested, "Do you girls feel like watching the feud in person?" Riley took the lead immediately when there was such an exciting idea. "I'm definitely going." Maisie did not say anything. She could only tag along if she wanted to know more. The three of them hid behind a screen in the lounge to eavesdrop, and the middle-aged man's voice sounded. "Christina, sister-in-law, Katrina and I aren't what you think we are. She's my secretary." Maisie was stunned. "Sister-in-law? If that's the case, isn't this man Yael Boucher's younger brother and Helios' uncle, Eugene Boucher?" Maisie glanced at Barbara and Riley, who seemed to have long known the identity of that man. But what surprised her was that Barbara had recognized the people from the Bouchers and had already expected Eugene's extramarital affair since the very beginning of the auction. Otherwise, she would not have given off that creepy smirk. Christina Hill is Helios' mother. And she's Eugene's sister-in-law. If she knew about her brother-in-law's affair with the woman and that he would bring her here to this gem hunting event, it wouldn't surprise me that she's come here to confront him. The Bouchers are a well-known family in Bassburg. And Eugene's mistress hasn't been exposed after so many years. That alone is enough to show that Eugene's done well when it comes to concealing his affair with the woman. This also proves that the Bouchers don't like flaws in the family. And Mrs. Boucher may be one of them who takes the reputation of the Bouchers very seriously. That's why she's come out here to warn Eugene to restrain himself. But if Barbara didn't come to the gem hunting event just to buy herself a raw gemstone, what did she come here for? She even brought Riley and me along. This is something that I can't get my head around it. Mrs. Boucher picked up the teacup from the table. You don't have to explain yourself. I finally understand why Samantha wants to divorce you now. Since you can be so heartless to Samantha, then divorce her. But let me make it clear to you now, the Bouchers will never take in Katrina.